And with me now is Jonathan Wilkinson, the Federal Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. Minister, I want to start with Bill C-50 and what the Conservatives are saying about why they're opposing this bill, why they're taking the action they're taking. They're claiming, this is going to lead to the loss of about 170,000 direct Canadian jobs. It's going to displace another 450,000 direct and indirect jobs, that this is what they call a top-down central planning approach that's targeting the destruction of the oil and gas sector. You've obviously been arguing against this today in the House of Commons. Why do you believe you're right in your approach, and why do you think they're wrong?
Well, I think the Conservative approach has been, to be honest, pretty hard to understand. It is so over the top, it is almost unbelievable. So this bill is actually about setting up a framework. I wonder if my Conservative colleagues have actually even read the bill. It's 11 pages long. The major thing that it actually does is it sets up a council that will be comprised of labor, Indigenous organizations, industry, and environmental organizations to provide recommendations to the government about how we actually grow a clean economy going forward. It builds on work that we've been doing across the country, and very much including Alberta and the oil and gas sector. It includes things like the $4 billion that Air Products is putting up to build a hydrogen plant that uses natural gas, and the $12 billion investment that Dow Chemical is putting in place in Alberta to build the world's first net zero petrochemical facility. So this is about building an economy that's going to be strong in what necessarily must be a lower carbon future. One believes the science of climate change, and I would say 99.99% of climate scientists agree. Then you need to actually be thinking about the economic side of the equation, and that's what this does.
I do want to ask about your ultimate timeline for getting this bill through Parliament and into law, because given what we've seen so far in the House and at committee with opposition, what's your sense of the timeline for getting this bill passed into law? And then I do also want to ask you about the actual timeline for these measures coming into effect, because of course, there have been amendments on the actual coming into force date for this bill.
Yeah, so certainly, it's been a struggle. The bill has been for the House now for a little bit less than a year, in large measure because of obstruction from the Conservative Party. When it was in committee, they had a AI-induced sort of robo-amendment process where they proposed 20,000 different amendments to an 11-page bill. It gets to the point where this is kind of legislative vandalism. It's not reasonable sort of behavior in the House of Commons. But I would say in terms of getting the bill through, we are hopeful to get it through the House of Commons quite expeditiously. But it, of course, then has to go to the Senate, which will want to study the bill. But my intention is to try to move this along as quickly as possible, understanding that the Senate and the senators will want to have their own appropriate look at that, and that's the way Parliament should work. And then to actually move this into force, one of the first things that we will be required to do under this bill is to bring forward an action plan, a final action plan in 2024. We've released an interim action plan last year, and that's available publicly. But we've said that we will be required to bring forward an action plan, and governments going forward will be required to bring forward action plans every 5 years. Part of what this bill does is create transparency mechanisms to force governments to be able to be transparent with people about the work that they are doing to ensure that they're growing an economy that can be strong in a low-carbon future.
Okay, I want to turn to carbon pricing now, because we've heard the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, say that the current federal plan is putting too much of a burden on people and not enough on big polluters. Does he have a point? Because your government has talked a lot, obviously, about affordability challenges that Canadians are facing right now.
Well, absolutely, affordability needs to be top of mind for everybody. But I would say I haven't seen Mr. Singh's specific comments. I'd be more than happy to sit with Mr. Singh and have a conversation and to explain how the industrial pricing system works. There is an industrial pricing system in Canada. It does require that large polluters pay, and that is very important. That's part of the pricing mechanism is to incent large polluters to actually pollute less. The consumer price is a different mechanism, and it is focused on ensuring that we're creating incentives to people to make more efficient choices. But on the consumer side, it's built in a way that actually does address affordability. I mean, 200 economists wrote a letter just 2 weeks ago that actually demonstrated that it's the most efficient way to reduce carbon emissions. And it does it in a manner where 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back. And the people who actually end up paying more than they get back are people who have a 6,000 square foot house, a Hummer in their front drive, and a boat in the backyard. And, at the end of the day, those are the folks that are polluting the most. They should pay more.
So are those the kind of arguments then that, your government would be willing to put up at a First Minister's meeting on carbon pricing? We know that motion passed yesterday with Bloc and NDP support. We've seen several premiers suggesting it. We've even seen a former environment minister in your government, Catherine McKenna, say she's supportive of the idea. Do you think that meeting should happen?
Well, let me say, first of all, at the beginning of this process back in 2016, there was a meeting of the First Ministers during the development of the Pan-Canadian Framework, and all of the ministers, with the exception of one at the time, signed on to a plan that included carbon pricing. I would say that certainly we're not ruling it off the table, but before you get into a position where you're demanding a meeting, I think it's incumbent on the premiers to actually come up with some alternatives. And that's particularly true for premiers who have no climate plans. Like, look, Premier Moe in Saskatchewan has no climate plan. He has no targets between now and 2030. He has no target between now and 2050. He has no detailed action as to how he's going to reduce emissions. The same could be said to be true in Alberta and in New Brunswick. So at the end of the day, folks actually have to come up with reasonable alternatives about how you're fighting climate change. Unless you're like Premier Moe, who said, carbon pricing is more, they looked at every other option. They were all more expensive than carbon pricing, but he doesn't want to do carbon pricing. So the implication is he's not going to do anything to fight climate change. Well, I'm not sure there's a real good basis for a conversation there. But if they actually want to come forward with plans that actually show how they're going to make progress, that include some kind of pricing mechanism, of course, we're open to those conversations. We talk to the provinces pretty much every week about these kinds of issues.
All right, Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, we have to leave it there. Thanks for your time on this.
All right, thank you.